Imagine a failed Chinese schoolteacher who suddenly claims he's the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent by heaven itself to cleanse China of demons, abolish sex, and build a utopia called the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. Sounds divine, right? But just wait. This so-called prophet, Hong Xiuquan, would go on to spark a rebellion that left over 20 million people dead. His heavenly kingdom turned into a nightmarish regime of mass executions, twisted moral laws, and harem chambers filled with hundreds of concubines, all in the name of God. In this episode of Nutty Time Tales, we're diving into one of the strangest, bloodiest, and most hypocritical revolutions in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. A movement born out of religious delusion, fueled by fanatic devotion, and drowned in a sea of violence and lust. From a poor man's divine hallucination to a catastrophic empire of death, today we uncover how a single man's vision of heaven turned 19th century China into hell on earth. Ready to enter the madness? Let's begin. Picture this. It's 1843 in southern China, a time when poverty, famine, and corruption choke the Qing Empire like a slow poison. Villages are starving, taxes are unbearable, and Western missionaries are spreading a new and confusing religion, Christianity. Amid all this chaos stands Hong Xiuquan, a poor village schoolteacher who's failed the imperial civil service exams not once, not twice, but 4 times. In China, that exam was your golden ticket to power and respect. Fail it, and you were a nobody. By his 4th failure, Hong had a complete mental breakdown. He collapsed, feverish and delirious for days. But what happened next changed history forever. Hong claimed that during his illness he had a divine vision. In it, he saw a majestic old man with a golden beard, surrounded by angels and radiant light. The man called Hong his son and commanded him to slay demons and cleanse the world of evil. When Hong awoke, he didn't fully understand what he'd seen. Years later, after reading a Christian missionary pamphlet about Jesus Christ, everything clicked, or at least it did in Hong's mind. He decided the man in his vision was God, and Jesus was his elder brother. Which made him, Hong Xiuquan, the divinely chosen younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to Earth to destroy demons, or as he'd soon redefine them, the Manchu rulers of China. Crazy? Absolutely. But Hong's conviction was terrifyingly persuasive. He began preaching his new revelation, gathering followers among China's poorest and most desperate. He promised them equality, land, and salvation. He burned idols, banned opium, and demanded that men and women live separately in strict celibacy. The irony? That same man would later build a palace full of concubines. Hong's movement grew rapidly. He formed the Society of God Worshippers, which blended distorted Christianity with Chinese folk beliefs and a dash of his own divine ego. Soon his followers began calling him the Heavenly King. They sang hymns, carried crosses, and destroyed Confucian temples, convinced they were fighting a holy war. Hong preached that the Qing Dynasty was a demonic regime that had to be annihilated. By the late 1840s, his sermons had transformed into full-blown rebellion. Thousands of peasants, miners, and farmers joined his ranks, carrying banners of heavenly peace and chanting, "Destroy demons, serve God." And yet, under that holy cry, the seeds of blood and chaos were already sprouting. Because while Hong preached purity and divine order, what he was truly building was not a kingdom of heaven, but an empire of fanaticism, paranoia, and slaughter. Soon, his small band of believers would march into battle, and the deadliest civil war in human history would begin. By 1850, Hong Xiuquan's cult had evolved from a fringe religious sect into a full-blown army of zealots. They called themselves the Taiping Rebellion, the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. Peace, of course, was the last thing they brought. Hong and his right-hand man, Yang Xiuqing, began gathering tens of thousands of followers in southern China's Guangxi province. These weren't trained soldiers. They were peasants, miners, women, and children, all united by faith, poverty, and rage. They believed they were soldiers of God, literally. Before battle, they sang hymns, chanted prayers and claimed the Holy Spirit filled their bodies with divine strength. Some even said that bullets couldn't harm them if they shouted, "Hallelujah," loud enough. Imagine it, tens of thousands of ragtag peasants, wielding swords and rusty muskets, charging into the battlefield, shouting praises to a Chinese version of Jesus, and unbelievably, they started winning. The Qing troops, weakened by corruption and opium addiction, were no match for the religious fury of Hong's followers. City after city fell to the Taiping forces, their banners painted with heavenly slogans and blood. But wherever they went, they left devastation behind. Villages were burned, scholars executed, and temples destroyed in the name of divine purity. By 1853, they captured Nanjing, one of China's most important cities. Hong declared it the new capital of his divine realm, renaming it Tianjing, or the heavenly capital. Inside its walls, the heavenly kingdom took shape. Part theocracy, part dictatorship, part fever dream. Hong Xiuquan lived in palatial luxury, surrounded by jade, silk, and gold, despite preaching poverty. He forbade alcohol, opium, gambling, and prostitution, but built a sprawling royal harem of concubines, claiming they were celestial maidens, chosen by divine will. His followers weren't allowed to question him. After all, he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. To disagree with him was to defy heaven itself. Under his rule, everything in Nanjing was divided by gender and faith. Men and women lived in separate quarters. Families were split apart. Even married couples were forbidden to live together unless they received special permission from Hong himself. It was a city of divine order, but also suffocating paranoia. His inner circle, the heavenly kings, constantly plotted against each other. Hong, who once spoke of peace, now ordered executions for the slightest disobedience. And then there was Yang Xiuqing, the self-proclaimed East King, who claimed the Holy Spirit spoke through him. During his trances, he would convulse and speak with a booming voice, giving divine commands that Hong's followers dared not disobey. At first, Hong tolerated it, but as Yang's influence grew, paranoia took over. In 1856, Hong ordered his soldiers to massacre Yang and thousands of his followers, accusing him of blasphemy. Blood flowed through the streets of the heavenly capital. Hong then declared that all authority belonged to him alone, the true representative of heaven. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, once born of dreams of salvation, had descended into a nightmarish cult state of executions, fear, and twisted faith. And yet, outside the city walls, his rebellion kept growing. More than 20 million people would eventually die in what became the bloodiest civil war in human history, deadlier than World War I, the American Civil War, and the Napoleonic Wars combined. But what made people still follow him? What kind of promise could make peasants lay down their lives for a man who called himself the brother of Christ and lived like an emperor? That's where the real madness begins. If you had stepped inside the gates of the Taiping capital in the 1850s, you would have seen something that looked, at first glance, like a holy utopia. Clean streets, no drunken brawls, no gambling, no opium dens. Every man and woman wore simple clothes, and giant banners declared, "All under heaven belongs to God." But underneath that divine discipline was one of the most controlling and hypocritical regimes in history. Hong Xiuquan's heavenly laws banned nearly every pleasure humans could enjoy, yet he indulged in all of them himself. Ordinary citizens were forbidden to drink alcohol, smoke, or even sing secular songs. Yet Hong's palace hosted lavish feasts with wine, music, and dance. He forbade men and women from touching each other, except for his growing collection of wives and concubines. And this wasn't just a few wives. Hong Xiuquan kept a harem of dozens, possibly hundreds, of women, claiming each was spiritually married to him. He called them his heavenly sisters and said they were helping him fulfill divine duties. Some of these women were captured peasants. Others were the wives of his own officers, taken by decree. None could refuse, because to defy Hong was to defy God. He even built a walled-off garden complex where only women and eunuchs could enter. There he spent his days surrounded by celestial companions, composing hymns and, according to some surviving accounts, sleeping through most of his kingdom's crises. Outside the palace walls, his subjects were starving and dying in endless wars. But inside, the heavenly king claimed he was too divine to handle earthly matters. Instead, he spent his time rewriting the Bible, literally. He tore out parts he didn't like, added new commandments, and replaced God with his own name in several passages. The 10 Commandments became flexible. One of his new rules stated, "Those who offend the heavenly king offend heaven." It was no longer about faith, it was about control. Even the smallest sins were punishable by death. Steal a loaf of bread? Execution. Argue with a superior? Execution. Speak against the heavenly king? Torture, then execution. The heavenly kingdom had turned into a paranoid dictatorship cloaked in holiness. And yet, the irony was almost poetic. While Hong's followers died enforcing his moral code, his own court resembled a twisted reflection of the imperial decadence he once claimed to destroy. He replaced the Qing emperor's dragon robes with his own celestial vestments, made of silk and gold. He banned the opium trade, but when he fell ill, he secretly took medicinal opiates, calling them divine elixirs. His followers, meanwhile, believed he could not die, that as the brother of Jesus, he was immortal. But Hong's health was deteriorating. Years of paranoia, indulgence, and spiritual delusion had left him fragile. And yet, even as the world around him collapsed, he saw visions of angels and divine light. He believed he was still destined to rule all of China, and perhaps the world. What's truly eerie is how similar this all sounds to other cult leaders across history. Men who mix religion, ego, and fear until their followers can no longer tell truth from madness. But Hong's cult wasn't just a small sect. It was an army, and their faith would soon consume entire provinces, because Hong's delusion was about to meet the unstoppable force of Western firepower. And when that collision came, it would drown China in blood. By the early 1850s, Hong Xiuquan's delusional dream of a divine empire had metastasized into full-blown holy war. What began as a strange cult of farmers and converts turned into one of the largest and bloodiest conflicts in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. And here's the shocking part. This wasn't just a local uprising. It was a civil war that killed more people than World War I, an estimated 20 to 30 million dead. Let that sink in. Tens of millions gone. All because one failed scholar thought he was Jesus Christ's younger brother. A holy war ignites in 1851. Hong Xiuquan declared the founding of his heavenly kingdom of great peace, Taiping Tianguo. He claimed divine command to destroy the demon Qing Dynasty and replace it with his purified rule. At first, his army was a ragtag mix of peasants, miners, and poor converts. But desperation is a powerful fuel, and so is belief. Hong promised equality, free land, and the end of corruption. Thousands joined him. Then tens of thousands. And in just a few years, this divine militia ballooned to millions of fanatical soldiers, men, women, and even children, all sworn to the heavenly king. They carried banners reading Heavenly Father's soldiers and sang hymns as they marched into battle. Some went to their deaths chanting Hong's rewritten prayers. The Taiping army stormed through southern China like a plague. They burned opium dens, toppled temples, and executed Qing officials, often in brutally theatrical fashion. They believed every death brought them closer to cleansing the world. The fall of Nanjing in 1853, they captured one of China's grandest cities, Nanjing, and renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. From there, Hong ruled as a god king, but his rebellion didn't just threaten the Qing, it terrified the Western powers too. Britain and France had just forced China to open its ports after the Opium Wars, and now they watched in horror as a Christian-inspired cult threatened their profits. The British press at first thought Hong might be their ally, a Christian reformer who could modernize China. But when reports of mass executions, forced conversions, and cannibalism trickled out, they realized this was no holy reform. This was apocalypse, a war of fanatics. What made the Taiping Rebellion so uniquely horrifying was the fervor. The Taiping soldiers fought not for land or money, but for salvation. Entire families marched into battle with homemade weapons. Villagers who refused to join were slaughtered as demons, and yet the Qing Dynasty was just as brutal in response. the imperial forces burned entire towns to the ground, executed prisoners by the thousands, and displayed heads on spikes as warnings. China became a patchwork of smoking ruins and corpse-littered rivers. The Yangtze River, the lifeline of the South, turned black with ash and blood. Refugees starved on the roads. Epidemics raged. And through it all, Hong's followers kept praying, convinced that their suffering was a divine test. Western involvement. Eventually, the Qing struck a desperate deal with the devil, Western mercenaries. Enter Frederick Townsend Ward and later Charles Chinese Gordon, British officers who led brutal, modernized forces known as the ever-victorious army. With Western guns, cannons, and tactics, the Qing began to push back. The Heavenly Kingdom's armies, though massive, were poorly equipped, and Hong's divine protection did not stop bullets. The battles that followed were some of the most savage urban sieges in 19th century history. Cities fell one by one, and with each fall came massacres. By 1864, Nanjing, the heavenly capital, was surrounded. The Qing army launched a final fiery assault. When they broke through, the city became a slaughterhouse. Men, women, and children were butchered in the streets. Hong Xiuquan was found dead, likely from poisoning or illness, and his body was burned. His ashes were blown from a cannon to prevent his followers from making a shrine. And just like that, the kingdom of heaven ended, not with divine light, but in smoke, blood, and gunpowder. The aftermath: when the dust settled, China was shattered. Entire provinces had been depopulated. Crops rotted in the fields. Villages vanished. It's said that so many died that entire regions had to be repopulated decades later. But the Taiping Rebellion wasn't just a war, it was a warning. It showed how faith, when twisted by delusion and desperation, can become one of the deadliest forces on Earth. And yet, that's not the last twist in this story, because decades later, Hong Xiuquan's strange mix of Christianity and rebellion would inspire a new generation of revolutionaries, including some who helped shape modern China itself. When Hong Xiuquan's ashes were blasted from a cannon in 1864, most assumed that his bizarre heavenly kingdom would vanish with the smoke. But history has a twisted sense of humor, because the Taiping Rebellion, born from a failed exam, students' hallucinations, didn't just destroy millions of lives. It planted seeds that would later help transform China from a crumbling empire into a revolutionary powder keg, the ghost that wouldn't die. After the war, China looked like the aftermath of the apocalypse. Fields were abandoned. Skeletons littered the countryside. Trade had collapsed. The Qing Dynasty had technically won, but the cost was catastrophic. They were so weakened that even victory felt like defeat. And amid the ruins, whispers persisted. Some survivors still believed Hong Xiuquan had ascended to heaven, and that one day he'd return to finish his holy mission. In southern China, secret sects kept Taiping songs and symbols alive, hiding them beneath peasant rituals and folk traditions. To the Qing court, these were dangerous embers, ready to spark another inferno. Rebels, revolutionaries, and copycats. The Taiping movement became a model, a blueprint for rebellion. Long before Karl Marx's name reached China, Hong Xiuquan's ideas of equality, communal land, and wealth redistribution had already spread through rumor and legend. Later uprisings, like the Boxer Rebellion, 1899, and the communist movements of the 20th century, borrowed from that same well of anti-imperial fury and utopian dreams. Even Mao Zedong, nearly a century later, would study the Taiping Rebellion and call Hong Xiuquan a proto-revolutionary. Of course, Mao left out the divine hallucinations and 1,000-woman harems, but the idea of uniting the masses to destroy a corrupt ruling class, that was straight from the Heavenly King's playbook. And here's the truly ironic twist. Hong's rebellion, meant to build a divine kingdom, actually paved the way for China's eventual turn toward atheism and communism. Religion had burned too many lives. Faith had failed too many hearts. So when the next revolution came, it came with fists instead of prayers. The Western reaction, fear and fascination. While China burned, the Western world watched in both horror and morbid fascination. Missionaries debated whether Hong Xiuquan was a misguided convert or the devil's pawn. British newspapers described him as a mad Christian emperor, while others saw him as a tragic example of what happens when colonial religion meets local desperation. Historians in London and Paris pored over captured Taiping documents, horrified by how closely Hong's theology mirrored Christianity, and yet how grotesquely it had been twisted. He had rewritten the Ten Commandments. He called Jesus his elder brother, but outlawed most Christian clergy. He preached purity while indulging in divine debauchery. It was both familiar and utterly alien. In many ways, the Taiping Rebellion became a mirror, showing the West what happens when imperial faith is exported without understanding the culture it lands in. Rebuilding from the ashes after the rebellion's end, the Qing government tried desperately to reassert control. They rebuilt cities, reformed the army, and modernized weapons. But trust in imperial power had been shattered. The once mighty dynasty never fully recovered. By 1911, just a few decades later, it collapsed completely, replaced by a republic born from revolution. And that revolution carried the DNA of the Taiping dream. The same dream of remaking society from the ground up, even if it meant blood and fire, even today. In Chinese historical memory, the Taiping Rebellion sits uneasily. It's too massive to ignore, too strange to glorify. It's a cautionary tale and a dark inspiration all at once. Some view Hong Xiuquan as a mad prophet. Others see him as an early rebel against oppression. But most agree on one thing. He was the spark that showed how easily faith can become fanaticism, and how quickly a vision of heaven can turn into hell. The legacy of a false messiah. Think about this. One delusional man, failed by the civil service exam system, misinterpreted a missionary pamphlet, and his misunderstanding unleashed a war that killed tens of millions. If history ever needed proof that ideas can be deadlier than weapons, the Taiping Rebellion is it. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all, that long after Hong's heavenly kingdom crumbled, his madness lived on, reshaped, repurposed, and reborn in every new movement that promised paradise on earth. Imagine walking into a palace where silence is law, where every woman you see is draped in silk and forbidden to make eye contact, and where the man on the throne claims to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, chosen by God to rule the world. That was the heavenly palace in Nanjing, the glittering heart of Hong Xiuquan's empire, and the epicenter of one of history's strangest, darkest cults of power, purity, and pleasure. The divine emperor of heaven and earth by 1853. The Taiping forces had conquered Nanjing, renaming it Tianjing, the heavenly capital. Here, Hong Xiuquan declared himself heavenly king, establishing his throne as both a royal seat and a divine altar. No one could look directly at him. Courtiers crawled on their knees in his presence. Even his closest generals were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Hong claimed that God communicated with him daily through dreams, giving him instructions on how to purify the earth and cleanse the people of sin. And what counted as sin? Just about everything he personally disliked: alcohol? Sin music? Sin of sex outside divine approval? Eternal damnation. He even banned laughter and dancing, calling them tools of the devil. But behind palace walls, the heavenly king's own behavior was anything but pure. The holy sisters, heaven's virgins in public. Hong Xiuquan promoted strict sexual morality. Men and women lived in segregated quarters. Even married couples were separated unless given divine permission. Yet inside the inner sanctum, Hong created a harem unlike anything seen before, a labyrinth of pleasure disguised as piety. He called the women in his harem the holy sisters. Some were chosen for their beauty, others for their devotion, and a few were simply taken as tribute by local governors trying to earn divine favor. In total, historians estimate that the heavenly king had hundreds, possibly over 1,000, women in his inner palace. They were divided into ranks. The 12 heavenly concubines, his personal favorites, claimed to share his divine mission. The heavenly maidens, who served him daily meals and sang hymns in his honor. And the attendants of the sacred bedchamber, who tended to him spiritually, though everyone knew what that meant. But here's where it gets even creepier. Hong claimed that sleeping with him purified women's souls. He told his followers that his divine energy would wash away earthly impurity through contact, making the act not lustful, but holy. In essence, he turned sex into a religious sacrament, binding these women to him in both body and spirit. The price of disobedience inside the palace, rules were absolute. No woman could leave once chosen. Any attempt to escape was punished by public execution. Hong's eunuch guards, known as the Heavenly Protectors, enforced these rules with brutal precision. Servants who spoke out of turn vanished. Women accused of impurity were beheaded in the courtyards, their deaths witnessed by others as moral instruction. One British observer later wrote that Tianjin was a city where piety and terror slept in the same bed. And Hong himself? He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that assassins lurked everywhere, even among his concubines. He ordered some of them to drink poison to prove their loyalty. Others were executed on suspicion of spiritual corruption. By the end, his heaven had turned into a suffocating nightmare of obedience, fear, and delusion. The double standard of heaven, while his followers starved and his armies bled, the heavenly king feasted. His palace was filled with gold, jeweled ornaments, and intricate murals depicting him ascending to heaven beside Jesus. His meals consisted of rare fruits, honeyed rice, and imported delicacies, even as the surrounding countryside withered under famine. And yet, his sermons still preached humility and sacrifice. To the faithful, he told them, "Earthly hunger purifies the spirit, but behind closed doors, Hong's hunger was only for power and for the endless worship of his own image." Even his generals began to question him. Yang Shuqing, the voice of God, once dared to demand equal authority, claiming he too received divine messages. Hong's response? He had Yang and his entire household slaughtered, tens of thousands in total, to remind everyone that only one voice spoke for heaven. The fall of the heavenly harem. By the time the Qing army breached Tianjin's walls in 1864, the palace was a decaying dream. The once beautiful courtyards were filled with the bones of the dead. Most of Hong's concubines had either committed suicide or been killed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. In one chamber, Qing soldiers discovered rooms filled with silk-covered corpses, women who had chosen death over capture. In another, they found Hong Xiuquan's bed, draped in gold cloth embroidered with divine symbols, and next to it, his final meal, a simple fruit bowl. He had starved himself to death, believing God would rescue him. Instead, his empire collapsed into ash and silence, and the heavenly harem that was supposed to symbolize divine purity became the ultimate symbol of human corruption. When the smoke cleared over Nanjing in 1864, what remained of the heavenly kingdom was nothing but ruin. Smoldering temples, collapsed palaces, and the faint echo of hymns once sung to a self-proclaimed son of God. The Taiping Rebellion was over, but its scars, from both physical and spiritual, would haunt China for generations. Let's put this in perspective. By the time it ended, the Taiping Rebellion had killed between 20 and 30 million people. More than World War I, entire provinces were wiped clean. Rivers ran red for miles. Cities like Nanjing and Hangzhou became ghost towns. The rebellion had begun as a movement of equality and purity, a promise to rid the world of corruption and sin. But it ended as one of history's bloodiest nightmares, ruled by paranoia, lust, and delusion. Hong Xiuquan's kingdom of heaven became hell on earth. And what's truly terrifying is that he believed he was saving people, that every drop of blood was holy, every death justified. Looking back, historians often describe the Taiping movement as a collision between religion and rebellion, where faith morphed into fanaticism. At its core, Hong's message wasn't unique. He promised salvation, equality, and divine justice. But his obsession with control, purity, and power twisted that message into something monstrous. His followers didn't see him as a tyrant. They saw him as the voice of heaven. When he commanded them to kill, they killed. When he banned food, they starved. When he claimed his harem was holy, they nodded in silence. It's a chilling reminder that even the most righteous cause can rot when blind faith replaces reason. And while Hong's heavenly kingdom collapsed, the psychology behind it, the need to believe in something absolute, never really went away. You might think the Taiping Rebellion is ancient history, but echoes of it still ripple today. In the 20th century, both Chinese nationalists and communists studied Hong Xiuquan's methods. They admired how he mobilized the poor, used ideology to inspire loyalty, and created a complete alternative society. Of course, they ignored the madness, paranoia, and sex cults. But the blueprint of mass control through belief was there. Even today, the rebellion stands as a strange paradox. It inspired early visions of equality and social reform, yet it drowned those ideals in fanaticism and cruelty. Hong wanted to build paradise, but instead, he built a nightmare so vast that it changed the course of Chinese history forever. But amidst the grand battles and political upheavals, we often forget the silent victims and the women of the heavenly palace. Most of their names are lost to history. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't escape. But they were real, daughters, wives, sisters, trapped in a gilded cage built by a man who promised heaven and delivered horror. Some were forced into his harem. Others were executed in the name of purity. A few believed until the very end that they were serving God's will. Their stories, buried beneath layers of myth and propaganda, remind us that every divine empire is built on the bones of the powerless, and that's the true tragedy of the Taiping Rebellion. It wasn't just a war between kings, it was a war between belief and reality, and belief won. For far too long, Hong Xiuquan began as a failed scholar, tormented by dreams and visions. He ended as a self-anointed messiah commanding an empire of corpses. But if you strip away the religious fever, what you see is something deeply human. A man who couldn't accept failure, who turned his rejection into prophecy. His story is a warning about what happens when one man's obsession with destiny consumes the world around him. History is filled with such figures, men who believe they've been chosen by a higher power, who demand loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice. And time and again, they lead humanity not to salvation, but into chaos. In the end, Hong Xiuquan's heavenly kingdom was neither heavenly nor a kingdom. It was a mirror, reflecting the dangers of faith without question, power without accountability, and belief without compassion. The ruins of Tianjin may be gone, but the warning remains etched in blood and memory. When a man claims to speak for heaven, listen carefully, because sometimes it's hell that answers back. So what do you think, time travelers? Was Hong Xiuquan a madman, a visionary, or something far darker? History is full of people who've promised paradise, but few left a trail as twisted and tragic as the Heavenly King. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the weirdest, bloodiest, and most disturbing rebellions in history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more Nutty Time Tales, where the past is always stranger than fiction, because as we've seen today, sometimes heaven's gates are just the entrance to hell.